Empathy doesn't disappear after healing. It changes. And that change is one of the most unsettling parts of the process. Before healing, empathy felt automatic. You felt what others felt without choosing to. You entered emotional spaces before you realized you were there. You carried moods, tension, and unspoken needs as if they were your responsibility. That felt like care. That felt like being good. After healing, something quiet but profound happens. You still understand. You still notice. But you don't merge anymore. You can listen without absorbing. You can sense pain without rushing toward it. You can remain present without disappearing inside someone else's emotional state. And that's when doubt appears. You start wondering if something essential is missing, if empathy has gone dull, if healing somehow made you colder. Because empathy wasn't just a skill. It was an identity. You were the one who felt deeply, the one who understood first, the one who carried what others couldn't. So when empathy becomes quieter, it can feel like a loss, like a soft erasure of who you believed yourself to be. But nothing was lost. What ended was emotional fusion. Carl Jung understood that real psychological change doesn't remove our functions, it differentiates them. Empathy doesn't vanish after healing. It separates from self-sacrifice. And because this version of empathy is calmer, more boundaried, and less dramatic, it often feels unfamiliar at first. Almost wrong. But this shift isn't numbness. It's the beginning of empathy that no longer requires self-erasure. And learning to trust this new form is one of the most important transitions that happens after healing. For a long time, empathy felt like something natural, almost instinctive, as if you were simply born more sensitive, more attuned, more aware of what others felt. But empathy, as you lived it, was never neutral. It was adaptive. You learned early how to read a room, how to sense tension before it became visible, how to adjust your tone, your presence, your emotions to keep things smooth. This didn't come from weakness. It came from intelligence. Empathy became a way to stay safe. You might recognize this in very ordinary moments. Walking into a space and immediately scanning faces. Lowering your voice without realizing why. Feeling responsible for silence, for discomfort, for shifts you didn't cause. Your body learned these movements before your mind gave them meaning. So empathy wasn't just about understanding others. It was about managing emotional environments. Over time, this sensitivity stopped feeling like a strategy and started feeling like morality. Being empathic meant being good. Being attentive meant being kind. And staying connected meant staying flexible. You didn't just notice how others felt. You adjusted yourself around it. Carl Jung understood that when a psychological function becomes overused, it doesn't stay conscious. It sinks into identity. It becomes who you are, not something you choose. This is how empathy turned into fusion. Not listening, but absorbing. Not caring, but carrying. Not understanding, but taking responsibility for emotional states that were never yours to hold. Because this way of being once worked, it became invisible. You didn't question it. You trusted it. You built your sense of self around it. So when healing begins and this automatic empathy softens, it doesn't feel like growth. It feels like danger. Because the psyche doesn't register the loss of a strategy as relief. It registers it as risk. This is why the first change in empathy after healing feels so unsettling. Not because something essential is missing, but because something familiar is no longer running the show. And the system doesn't know yet what will replace it. That uncertainty is where the real transformation begins. Empathy doesn't disappear after healing. It's not like a TV commercial. It's not a magic switch. Nothing flashes. Nothing announces itself. It changes. And that change is one of the most unsettling parts of the process. Before healing, empathy felt automatic. You felt what others felt without choosing to. You entered emotional spaces before you realized you were there. You carried moods, tension, and unspoken needs as if they were your responsibility. That felt like care. That felt like being good. After healing, something quiet but profound happens. You still understand. You still notice. But you don't merge anymore. You can listen without absorbing. You can sense pain without rushing toward it. You can remain present without disappearing inside someone else's emotional state. And that's when doubt appears. You start wondering if something essential is missing, if empathy has gone dull, if healing somehow made you colder. Because empathy wasn't just a skill. It was an identity. You were the one who felt deeply, the one who understood first, the one who carried what others couldn't. So when empathy becomes quieter, it can feel like a loss, like a soft erasure of who you believed yourself to be. But nothing was lost. What ended was emotional fusion. Carl Jung understood that real psychological change doesn't remove our functions. It differentiates them. Empathy doesn't vanish after healing. It separates from self-sacrifice. And because this version of empathy is calmer, more boundaried, and less dramatic, it often feels unfamiliar at first, almost wrong. But this shift isn't numbness. It's the beginning of empathy that no longer requires self-erasure. And learning to trust this new form is one of the most important transitions that happens after healing. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. As empathy becomes quieter, something else gets louder. Guilt. Not the kind that comes from doing harm, but the kind that comes from not responding the way you used to. Before healing, empathy moved you immediately. When someone felt uncomfortable, you adjusted. When tension appeared, you stepped in. When someone needed support, you offered it before they had to ask. That response was automatic. And because it was automatic, it felt morally correct. After healing, the response changes. You notice someone's discomfort, and you don't rush to fix it. You hear a familiar story, and you don't feel pulled inside it. You sense emotional need, and your body stays relatively calm. That calm is what triggers guilt, because for a long time, caring meant movement, and now there is stillness. You might recognize this in small, everyday moments. You don't reply immediately, and a heaviness appears in your chest. You end a conversation without reassurance, and your mind starts replaying it. You choose not to step in, and you feel strangely responsible for how the other person feels. Nothing overt happened. No one accused you. No boundary was even spoken aloud. And yet guilt shows up. This guilt doesn't mean you failed empathy. It means empathy is no longer fused with self-erasure. The psyche has learned over time that emotional involvement equals goodness, that responsiveness equals care, that not intervening equals neglect. So when empathy no longer propels you into action, the old moral wiring activates. It tries to pull you back. Carl Jung understood this dynamic as part of the process of differentiation. When a function detaches from an identity, the psyche experiences tension. It feels as if something valuable is being lost, even when it's only being reorganized. This is why guilt often feels ethical. It doesn't say, "I'm uncomfortable." It says, "I'm doing something wrong." And that confusion is powerful, because guilt pushes you to restore the old order, to explain yourself, to soften the pause, to prove that you still care. But what's really being tested here is not your empathy. It's your ability to tolerate not acting on it immediately, to allow understanding without absorption, to allow concern without self-abandonment, to let empathy exist without turning it into responsibility. This is where many people return to old patterns, not because healing didn't work, but because guilt feels urgent and urgency feels like truth. But urgency is not truth. It's conditioning. And the appearance of guilt here is not a sign that empathy has diminished. It's a sign that empathy is no longer being used as a tool for regulation. It's learning to stand on its own, separate from sacrifice. This is an uncomfortable transition, but it's a necessary one, Because if empathy is always followed by guilt, it can never become conscious. It remains a reflex, not a choice. And healing is precisely about turning reflex into awareness. That's why this phase feels so confusing. Not because something is wrong, but because something is finally changing. It often starts with something small. You walk into a familiar space and notice the conversation soften as you approach. Voices lower slightly. Someone pauses mid-sentence. Another person gives a quick look, as if silently checking whether to continue. Nothing stops completely, but something shifts. Later, you don't hear accusations. You hear fragments. She's different lately. He doesn't react the same way anymore. I don't know, it just feels off. No one sounds angry. No one sounds cruel. But the tone carries quiet confusion. This is how gossip usually appears after healing. Not as an attack, but as orientation seeking. People are not trying to hurt you. They're trying to understand a change they can feel but can't explain. Your presence no longer regulates the emotional atmosphere the way it used to. Your empathy no longer fills the gaps automatically. Before healing, you played a subtle role in these spaces. You sensed when tension was building and softened it. You redirected conversations before they became uncomfortable. You absorbed emotional undercurrents so others wouldn't have to deal with them directly. Most of this happened without words. You didn't announce that you were helping. You simply adjusted. And because this adjustment was constant, people grew accustomed to it. They didn't see it as something you did. They experienced it as something you were. So when healing loosens that reflex, the absence is felt immediately. You may notice it in the smallest interactions. A joke lands differently, and you don't rush to smooth the moment. A tense comment hangs in the air longer than usual. Someone shares frustration, and you listen, but you don't carry it for them. These moments are subtle, but they accumulate. And when people feel a shift they can't name, they talk about it sideways. They compare impressions. They look for reasons. They try to restore a sense of predictability. This is why gossip emerges here. Not because you changed dramatically, but because you stopped buffering emotional discomfort. Carl Jung understood that when a person withdraws energy from a persona function, the social field reacts. Relationships that were unconsciously organized around that function must reorganize or become uneasy. The group feels the loss of something stabilizing, and instead of recognizing it as a structural change, they personalize it. They assume you're colder, more distant, less invested. What they're really reacting to is the loss of emotional access. Access to your immediate understanding. Access to your soothing presence. Access to the version of you who made everything feel easier. This can feel deeply unsettling to witness. You may sense that people are talking around you rather than to you. That they're forming conclusions without asking questions. That you're being quietly redefined without your input. And because you're still empathic, you feel this. You notice the pauses, the tonal shifts, the emotional undercurrents. But this time, you don't rush to correct them. You don't explain yourself. You don't perform reassurance. You don't step back into the role just to restore comfort. This restraint can feel almost cruel at first, because for a long time, being empathic meant preventing exactly this kind of discomfort. It meant making sure no one felt confused, unsettled, or emotionally exposed. Now you're allowing that discomfort to exist. And that changes the social dynamic. Some people adjust. They learn how to relate to you without leaning on your emotional labor. These relationships often become more honest, more mutual, more grounded. Others don't. They remain uneasy. They stay distant. They hold on to an image of who you used to be. This isn't because you failed them. It's because the relationship was built around a function you're no longer offering automatically. Jung believed that individuation inevitably disrupts group dynamics. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly through shifts in participation and presence. This phase can feel isolating. You may feel misunderstood without being confronted, judged without being accused, talked about without being addressed. But what's happening is not rejection. It's reorganization. You are no longer orienting the emotional field for others. And until new dynamics settle, confusion fills the space where your automatic empathy once lived. Witnessing this without collapsing back into old patterns is difficult, but it's also essential, because this is where empathy becomes conscious, no longer something the group uses, but something you choose when it aligns with who you are becoming. And that choice changes everything. After the social tension comes something quieter. It doesn't arrive as panic. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as a question you don't quite finish asking. If I'm not the one who feels everything, if I'm not the one who understands first, if I'm not the emotional anchor in every room, then who am I now? This fear isn't dramatic. It's subtle, persistent, and deeply unsettling. For a long time, empathy gave you orientation. It told you where you belonged in relationships. It told you how to be useful, how to matter, how to stay connected. You knew your role. You were the listener, the mediator, the one people came to when things felt heavy. Even when it exhausted you, it gave you a sense of place. After healing, that certainty dissolves. You enter familiar situations and don't immediately know how to position yourself. You're no longer scanning for emotional cues the same way. You're no longer stepping in automatically. And without that reflex, something feels missing. Not empathy, but definition. You may feel oddly invisible, less central, as if you're present but not fully located in the dynamic. Conversations move on without you intervening. Emotional moments arise and pass without your involvement. This can feel like irrelevance, and that feeling can be frightening, because when empathy functioned as identity, it answered a fundamental question. Why am I here? Healing removes that answer before offering a new one. Carl Jung described this phase as disidentification, the moment when a role that carried too much psychic energy is withdrawn. The psyche loosens its grip on an old self-image, but hasn't yet formed a new center. This creates a vacuum, and the psyche dislikes vacuums. So anxiety appears, restlessness, a subtle urge to return to what's familiar. Not because it was healthy, but because it was known. This is why many people mistake this phase for regression. They think something has gone wrong, that healing has stripped them of their depth, their warmth, their significance. But what's actually happening is a necessary interruption. Empathy was never meant to be your identity. It was meant to be a function. When a function becomes an identity, it limits the self. Jung believed that individuation requires the courage to exist without immediate definition, to tolerate uncertainty long enough for a more authentic orientation to emerge. That tolerance is uncomfortable. You may feel ungrounded, unsure of your value, disconnected from the version of yourself others recognized. But this does not mean you are becoming less. It means you are no longer organized around being needed. And that shift, as quiet as it is one of the most destabilizing parts of healing. Because when empathy stops answering the question, who am I for others, you are finally left to discover who you are for yourself. And that discovery doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with not knowing. Healed empathy doesn't arrive with clarity. It doesn't come with certainty. And it doesn't feel like a breakthrough. In fact, at first, it can feel strangely ordinary. You still notice what others feel. You still understand emotional nuance. But you no longer feel compelled to enter every emotional space you perceive. This is often when people say, I still care, but it's different now. And that difference is difficult to describe, because healed empathy doesn't pull you forward. It doesn't demand immediate response. It doesn't blur the line between understanding and responsibility. Instead, it allows you to stay where you are. You may notice this in quiet, almost forgettable moments. Someone shares something heavy, and you listen fully, but you don't take it home with you. A familiar emotional pattern appears, and your body doesn't tense the way it used to. You sense sadness, frustration, or need, and you don't feel the urge to resolve it. This doesn't mean you've become indifferent. It means empathy is no longer fused with self-abandonment. Before healing, empathy often required you to move toward the other person at the expense of your own center. You adjusted, softened, explained, absorbed, sometimes without realizing how much of yourself you were giving away. Now, empathy remains, but it has boundaries. And those boundaries are not walls. They are orientation points. You're no longer using empathy to stabilize the emotional environment. You're no longer responsible for how others regulate their feelings. You're no longer confusing presence with participation. Carl Jung understood this as a critical shift in individuation. A psychological function must detach from unconscious compulsion before it can serve the self consciously. Empathy, when unconscious, feels intense but draining. Empathy, when conscious, feels quieter but steadier. This steadiness can feel unfamiliar, because intensity once felt like proof of depth. Overwhelm once felt like proof of care. Exhaustion once felt like virtue. Now, empathy no longer proves anything. It simply exists. You may find that you're more selective, that you offer empathy where it aligns with your values, and step back where it would cost you your coherence. This selectivity is not cruelty. It's discernment. Healed empathy allows you to remain human without becoming porous. It lets you stay connected without disappearing. It lets you care without collapsing into responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, it frees empathy from the role of identity. You are no longer empathic in order to be someone. You are empathic because it is one of many ways you relate to the world. This doesn't make empathy smaller. It makes it sustainable. And sustainability, after years of emotional overextension, can feel almost unfamiliar. But it is here, in this quieter, steadier form, that empathy finally stops costing you your sense of self. If empathy feels different now, it's not because you lost something essential. It's because something essential stopped costing you yourself. Healing doesn't remove your sensitivity. It reorganizes it. What once pulled you outward now settles inward. What once demanded immediacy now allows choice. What once required self-erasure now respects your center. This transition can feel lonely, because the world often responds more easily to people who overgive, to those who smooth, absorb, and adjust without being asked. When that stops, confusion appears, both inside you and around you. But this confusion is not a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that empathy is no longer running unconsciously. Carl Jung understood that individuation is not about becoming better adapted to others. It's about becoming more faithful to the self. And that faithfulness always comes with a period of disorientation. You may still feel guilt. You may still feel unsure. You may still wonder if you're doing something wrong. But none of that means you've become colder. It means empathy is no longer your identity. It's no longer the way you earn belonging. It's no longer how you secure connection. It's no longer the role that tells you who you are. Empathy remains, but now it exists alongside discernment, boundaries, and choice. You don't have to feel everything to understand. You don't have to suffer to care. You don't have to disappear to remain human. This quieter empathy may not look impressive from the outside. It doesn't create drama. It doesn't demand recognition. But it is steadier, more sustainable, more truthful. And if this stage feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, that doesn't mean you're losing your way. It means you're moving deeper into it. This is life after healing. Not louder, not lighter, but more aligned. And learning to live from this place, without rushing back to who you were, is part of the work that continues quietly